At the edge of a mountain village in Goan, where red clay clings to every step and fog curls low over the rooftops at dawn, there lives a man who carves with one arm and 2 feet. His name is Tung. No one expected much from him after the accident, not even Tung himself. He had once worked at a lumber mill, tall, strong, the kind of man who could lift entire planks without a second thought. But one rainy afternoon, the blade slipped. A scream, a rush of blood. And just like that, his right arm was gone. The silence afterward was worse than the pain. People pitied him. Some avoided him. Others offered work out of sympathy, none of it useful. He tried selling lottery tickets, tried staying inside, tried forgetting what it felt like to hold a chisel. And then one day, angry and tired of feeling useless, he sat down beside a block of discarded wood. He wedged it between 2 bricks, placed the chisel between his toes, and began to carve with his left hand, pushing his legs, guiding, and every bit of pride he had left on the line. The first piece was ugly, rough, crooked, but it stood. The second was better. The third, a small wooden lion sold for the price of 2 days' meals. That was 5 years ago. Now his workshop is open to the mountain wind. His tools are laid out on a simple table made from scrap wood. He still carves sitting on the ground, 1 foot steadying the block, the other guiding the blade, his left hand leading the stroke. Tourists pass through, sometimes shocked by the sight. "Is that real?" they whisper. "Can he really carve like that?" He doesn't answer. He just smiles and lets the sound of the blade speak for him. If stories like these stir something inside you, if you believe strength isn't just muscle, but will subscribe to Woodcarving Artists, where we honor every soul who keeps carving even when life cuts deep. Tung doesn't want to be a symbol. He just wants to work. But when he carves the face of a tiger or the wings of a phoenix, people see something more: resilience carved into every line, struggle smoothed into every curve. And in the evenings, when the village grows quiet and the mist rolls back in, he sits by the fire with a blank block of wood in front of him, still searching, still shaping, still fighting for beauty. Because sometimes, even a man with 1 arm can carry an entire tradition. The day after the accident, the doctor told him the truth straight. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "But your right arm, we couldn't save it." Tung didn't cry. He just stared at the ceiling of the provincial hospital, listening to the sound of rain hitting the metal roof. In his mind, he kept seeing the blade spinning, hearing it bite through skin bone life. When he was discharged a week later, the village held a quiet gathering. Some brought food, others offered money. But no one knew what to say to a man whose identity had been carved from strength and now whose hands were no longer whole. For weeks, Tung stayed indoors. He didn't eat much. He didn't talk. He avoided mirrors, avoided tools, avoided the sound of anything sharp. The worst part, his old chisel set still neatly arranged on the shelf in the corner. A gift from his father. The first tool set he had ever owned. One evening, after too much rice wine and too many memories, he stood up, opened the wooden box, took out the largest chisel, and walked down to the river. He stood there for a long time, staring at the dark water. Then he shouted, not at anyone in particular, just to the sky, to fate, to wood maybe. And with one sharp motion, he hurled the chisel as far as he could. It vanished into the water with barely a splash. There he muttered, "It's done. I'm done." But something inside him didn't feel relieved. It felt hollow. The next morning he woke up early, restless. He sat by the river again, not shouting this time, just listening. And then he waded in, slowly, awkwardly, one-handed. But he searched the water blind beneath the silt and weeds until his fingers touched something solid. Cold, metal, familiar. He pulled it up. The same chisel, rust just beginning to form along the edge. A scar in the wooden handle from the impact. But it was there. And in that moment, something returned. Not pride, not certainty, just a refusal to end. If you've ever thrown something away in despair, only to find yourself reaching back for it when the pain settled, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where redemption often begins at the bottom of the river. That night, Tung cleaned the chisel with oil, wrapped the cloth around the handle, and with his left hand tried to grip it. It felt wrong, heavy, foreign. So he set it between his feet instead, steadied it with his toes, and began carving into a block of pine, not to create anything beautiful, but just to feel something again. The wood cracked. The lines were crooked, but they were his. By morning, he had carved a single word into the surface, "Consung, still alive." It wasn't much, but it was more than enough. The piece wasn't meant to be sold. It was a rough carving, a lion no bigger than a child's fist. The mane was uneven, the legs slightly warped, but the eyes were full of something unexpected. Determination. Tung hadn't planned on showing it to anyone. It had taken him 5 days carved in secret behind his house, using his left hand and his feet. It wasn't perfect, but it stood. And so when the traveling couple from Germany stopped by the village cafe and asked if there were any local crafts for sale, the shopkeeper pointed toward the edge of the rice field. "There's a man," she said. "He carves with one arm. Go see for yourself." Tung was sitting cross-legged in the dirt when they arrived. Chisel between his toes, a half-finished elephant cradled between his knees. The woman Anna watched in silence for a long while. She didn't ask him questions, didn't pull out her phone. She just looked at the way his left hand pressed into the grain, the way his toes moved like fingers, the way he stopped breathing right before each stroke. After a while, she walked over to the small table by the wall where a few finished carvings sat gathering dust. She picked up the lion. "How much for this?" Tung looked at her confused. He didn't speak much English. And besides, no one had ever asked that before. He held up both hands and shook his head, then pointed to the word "Consung" carved faintly into the lion's base. Anna stared at it for a long time. Her husband Eric took out a small notepad and scribbled something. He showed it to Tung. "Still alive." Tung nodded. Then Anna did something unexpected. She placed the lion gently on the table and left behind a folded bill. It wasn't much, maybe enough for 2 or 3 meals, but to Tung it felt heavier than gold. They didn't take photos. They didn't even ask for his name. They just bowed and walked away, leaving behind a silence filled with something Tung hadn't felt in years. Respect. If you believe that value doesn't come from perfection, but from presence, perseverance, and truth, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where every sale carries the weight of a soul that refused to quit. That night, Tung didn't celebrate. He simply unwrapped a new block of wood and started again. This time, it was a phoenix. Its wings crooked but lifted. He carved all night, and in the morning, as the sun broke over the rice fields, he set the finished bird beside the lion on the table, waiting, not for buyers, but for those who could see. The message came by motorbike. A young man with a backpack and a camera stopped outside Tung's house one hot afternoon, dusty from the ride. He didn't knock, just stood quietly watching Tung carve the wing of a phoenix with his foot steadying the block. After a few minutes, he stepped forward and introduced himself. "I'm Khan. I'm a freelance journalist. I think you're the story." Tung looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't quite understand, but Khan smiled and sat cross-legged in the dirt beside him. Khan had seen a photo online. A German traveler had posted an image of the lion on her travel blog. No caption, no backstory. Just a wooden lion on a wooden table with the faint words "still alive" burned into the base. The post had gone viral. "People think it's a metaphor," Khan said, "but I want them to know it's real." He stayed for 2 days, interviewed Tung with hand gestures and scribbled notes, watched how his foot wrapped around the chisel like a second hand, filmed short clips, silent ones, just blade breath and grain. When Khan returned to Hanoi, he posted the story online. No drama, just truth. "Meet Tung," it began. He lost an arm. He didn't lose his craft. Within 48 hours, the Craft and Culture Association of Vietnam reached out. They were organizing a national artisan showcase. They wanted Tung there, a small stipend, travel covered, 1 table, 1 chair. "Bring whatever your hands can carry," they said. Tung hesitated. He had never left Natam Bataan. He didn't know if he belonged in a room full of masters, full of smooth words and silk shirts. His clothes were simple, his tools were rusted, his reputation was only 4 statues deep. But Khan returned a week later with the letter and a promise. They don't need you to speak. Just carve. If you believe that even the quietest hands can stir a capital city, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where true craftsmanship needs no spotlight, only space to breathe. In early spring, Tung boarded the night train to Hanoi with a sack of carvings tied to his back and a chisel tucked into his belt. He didn't sleep. He didn't rehearse. He just watched the countryside roll past rice fields, rivers, forests, wondering if somewhere in the dark his father might be proud. At the showcase, Tung said nothing. He simply sat on the ground, feet bare, and began to carve. By noon, the crowd had gathered. By sunset, no one was talking. They just watched. A phoenix emerged from the block, not perfect, but powerful. You could see the lift in its wings, the tremble of rising. And when an old master approached and bowed to him in silence, Tung finally allowed himself to breathe. I'm not here to impress, he thought. I'm here because I didn't give up. After the Hanoi showcase, something shifted. Not just in the way people looked at Tung, but in the way Tung began to look at himself. He returned to his village with the same clothes, the same tools, the same quiet life. But something followed him home: letters, handwritten ones, typed emails printed out by neighbors, messages from across the country, from Dak Lak Hue Nha Trang, and even Saigon. They came from people who had lost limbs, people in wheelchairs, people with birth defects, veterans, farmers, artists, teenagers. I thought I was done, one letter read, until I saw how you carve. My son hasn't touched a pencil since the accident, but after watching your video, he drew again. They said I was useless. Now I want to try again. Tung read every letter slowly. Not because he was uneducated, but because every sentence felt heavy, holy. Like each one had been carved into him with the same pressure he gave the wood. He didn't write back. He carved. One day an old man arrived from Quang Ngai. One leg, a wooden cane. He said nothing, just sat beside Tung and watched him work. When Tung stood to leave, the man pulled out a small block of camphor wood and whispered, I don't need a teacher, just a reason. So they carved together side by side. Word spread. A woman with no hands showed up 3 days later. Her arms ended at the elbow, but she carried a small chisel between her teeth. A deaf teenager followed the week after, bringing nothing but his smile and a piece of driftwood. They weren't students. They were survivors. And Tung Hai didn't teach them how to carve. He showed them that they already could. If you believe that sometimes healing doesn't come from instruction, but from simply being seen, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where art isn't just skill, but sanctuary. They gathered every week under the tamarind tree behind his house. Some days only 2 or 3 showed up. Other days a dozen. No one was turned away. They didn't have a name for the group, just a shared understanding. This is where broken hands learn to remember their strength. They carved birds, masks, spoons, lions, tears. Sometimes the wood cracked. Sometimes they did too. But always they began again. And slowly, something new began to form, not just in their carvings, but in the village itself. Neighbors who once pitied Tung now offered snacks, chairs, extra wood. Children stopped to watch. Some stayed to learn. The hands they once called useless were now shaping something beautiful, not just in the grain of the wood, but in the way people looked at each other again. I didn't mean to start anything, Tung said once. I was just trying not to disappear. But that's the thing about true craft, it doesn't shout. It survives until one day it sings. It started as an accident. Tung was carving late into the evening, the oil lamp flickering beside him. He had no plan, just a block of sewer wood with a knot near the top and a crack running through its base. Most would have burned it for firewood, but he liked broken things. The sculpture began to take shape, the outline of a woman seated cross-legged, arms open, not in offering, not in prayer. Just open. He carved the folds of her dress, the curve of her spine, even the faint rise of her ribs beneath her chest. But when he reached the face, he stopped. There was a flaw in the wood. A knot too deep to sand, a split too risky to carve. He stared at it for a long time, then put the chisel down and left it blank. Not because he couldn't finish, but because something told him This one is meant to stay unseen. The next morning, the regulars gathered under the tamarind tree. Tung placed the faceless sculpture at the center of the group. No one said anything. They just carved around it, quiet, focused. Later that week, a woman arrived from Sok Trang. Her name was Hong. She was missing 3 fingers on one hand and walked with a limp. Her son had found one of Tung's carvings in a temple and tracked the location down online. She carried nothing but a small wrapped bundle. When she saw the faceless sculpture, she froze. Then slowly she sat beside it and touched the open arms with her remaining fingers. Tears rolled silently down her cheek. "She's me," she said. Tung didn't respond. He didn't have to. Hong reached into her bundle and pulled out a cracked photograph, faded, water-damaged. A younger version of herself holding a baby in one arm and a chisel in the other. Before the accident, she whispered, "I was a woodworker too." No one in the group moved. Hong asked to stay. That night, she slept beside the sculpture. The next morning, she carved again for the first time in 18 years. If you believe that sometimes the most powerful art doesn't show a face, but reflects a soul, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where every unfinished piece may be the truest one. Tung never gave the sculpture a name. He never sold it, never moved it. He simply placed it beneath the tamarind tree, where the wind could run through the hollow face and the sun could touch her open palms. And over time, others saw themselves in her too. A blind man said she looked like his mother. A mute girl signed that the blank face made her feel safe. A monk whispered, "This is compassion without condition." They called her many things. Tung just called her Cho Trong, the empty space. And that space was never empty again. They arrived in clean shirts and polished shoes, stepping carefully around puddles from the early rain. 3 officials from the Ministry of Culture and Rural Development, a translator, a photographer, and a man who didn't speak much, but whose gaze never left the carving of Cho Trong under the tamarind tree. Tung stood barefoot as always, covered in sawdust, a chisel tucked between his toes. He didn't rise to greet them. He just nodded once and kept carving. "We're here to observe," one of them said politely. "And possibly invest." The word invest echoed strangely in the air. They spent the day taking notes, interviewing villagers, measuring the space behind Tung's house. They saw the people, disabled, scarred, untrained, shaping wood with feet, mouths, elbows, one-handed grace. They saw children watching from fences, old women sanding statues with reverence. By afternoon, the lead official sat across from Tung. "We want to offer you funding," he said. "Real funding, a proper school, a center, classrooms, dormitories, equipment, staff." He handed over a folder, detailed blueprints. A vocational arts center, branded, managed, modern. You'd be its director. Your story would inspire thousands. Tung said nothing. The man waited. "You could help more people," he added. "Much more than this." He gestured at the tamarind tree, the open yard, the benches made from old crates. But Tung's eyes stayed on the grain in front of him. Later, Khan, now a regular visitor, asked quietly, "What will you do?" Tung didn't answer directly. He stood, walked to the sculpture with no face, rested his hand on its shoulder, then looked around. The boy carving with a stump, the woman with a chisel in her teeth, the girl who had never spoken but laughed every time her carving chipped. "This is not a school," Tung said. "This is soil. You don't grow a forest by building a fence. If you believe that not every good thing needs to become big to become meaningful, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where we celebrate roots, not just branches." He didn't reject the offer outright, but he asked for time. Days passed. The villagers discussed. Some urged him to accept. Others feared it would change everything. Then one morning, as he was carving a small sparrow, a young girl sat beside him and whispered, "If you leave, who will listen like you do?" That evening, Tung wrote his response. One paragraph. "I am grateful for your offer, but what we do here is not a program. It is a pulse. You are welcome to learn from it, but I will not shape it to fit a grant." The officials never replied, but a month later, an envelope arrived. Inside, no check, no form, just a single note unsigned. Sometimes the smallest places carry the loudest echoes. He didn't say it was his last, but those who watched him carve that week said something felt different. He wasn't slower, just more still. Like every movement had been pre-written, like the wood already knew what it was becoming. Tung chose a block of rosewood he had saved for years. Heavy, dense, veins like smoke. He carried it out with his left arm, steadied it with his knee, and placed it beneath the tamarind tree without a word. Then he sat. The usual crowd gathered, students, wanderers, locals. They didn't ask questions. They just carved around him as they always had. But no one touched that block but him. He worked for 7 days. No plans, no sketches, just instinct, one line at a time. The grain curved with him. By the end of the week, the form had emerged a single figure, genderless, ageless, seated on the ground. Not rising, not falling, just being. One hand rested on the knee, the other gone, intentionally. Where the second hand should have been, there was only smooth wood, unfinished, silent. But the face held something fierce. Eyes closed, mouth slightly parted, a posture of stillness and strength. There was no robe, no ornament, no name. When asked what it meant, Tung simply smiled. It's not for me to say. He didn't keep it under the tamarind tree. Instead, he carried it on foot 5 kilometers to the edge of the mountain, to a small unmarked shrine by the cliff, a place where offerings were left not to gods, but to loss. A child never found, a father never returned, a dream never finished. He placed it gently inside. No inscription, no plaque, and he walked away. If this story speaks to something wordless in you, something deep, something beyond explanation, subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where silence isn't the absence of meaning. It's where meaning begins. Tung still carves, sometimes spoons, sometimes birds, sometimes nothing for days. He still teaches, still listens, still wakes before the sun and lets the wind decide what comes next. But that's sculpture. It was the last time he carved not for someone or beside someone, but for something inside him that had waited all these years to be named without a name. Now visitors still find their way to that shrine. They sit before the faceless, one-armed statue and leave things behind: a bracelet, a crumpled letter, a broken pencil, a photo, a chisel, some cry, some sit, some leave with a little more than they came with. No one knows who carved it. There's no signature, but those who know, and those who don't feel it anyway.